Okay, let's start. Number 1. Balder. At an assembly of the gods that had turned, for reasons everyone present found delightful, into a game, spears and stones and axes were being hurled at a single figure standing calm and unarmored at the center of the circle, and every single weapon was glancing off him without so much as bruising his skin. The figure was Balder, son of Odin and Frigg, the most beloved being in the entire pantheon, so gentle and so radiant that his name itself became a byword in later Norse poetry for anything pure. His mother, Frigg, had grown uneasy after Balder began dreaming of his own death, and had responded the way a goddess with real power responds to a nightmare she cannot dismiss. She traveled the length of creation and extracted a formal oath from every single object in existence: fire, water, iron, stone, disease, every beast and every tree, that none of them would ever harm her son. When she returned, the gods tested the oath for sport, and it held completely, which is how throwing weapons at Balder became, briefly, the most popular entertainment in Asgard. Frigg had missed exactly one thing. A small young sprig of mistletoe growing west of Valhalla had seemed too harmless, too undeveloped, to bother swearing to, and she had passed over it without a second thought. Loki found the gap. Disguised as an old woman, he questioned Frigg directly and casually enough that she told him herself, without suspicion, that mistletoe alone had never been asked to swear anything. Loki cut a dart from the plant, walked to the edge of the game, and approached Hodder, Balder's own brother, who stood apart from the others because he was blind and could not join in the throwing. Loki offered to guide his aim as a kindness, placed the mistletoe dart in Hodder's hand, and steadied his arm as he threw it directly into his brother's chest. Balder died instantly, killed by the one object in the universe his mother had never thought to ask, thrown by the one god in the room who could not see what he was doing, guided by the one god who could see everything, and had engineered the entire sequence from a single, casual lie. What followed was an attempt to undo it that came agonizingly close to succeeding. Hel, ruler of the underworld, agreed to release Balder on one condition: that every single object in the 9 worlds weep for him, proof that his loss was universal and total. The gods sent messengers across all of creation, and everything wept, stone, metal, every animal, and every person, until the messengers reached a single giantess sitting alone in a cave who refused, declaring flatly that Hel could keep what she had. That giantess, most sources strongly imply, was Loki in another disguise, closing the loophole he had opened a second time, ensuring Balder stayed dead, and setting in motion the specific chain of vengeance and imprisonment that would eventually help trigger Ragnarok, the destruction of the entire cosmos the gods themselves inhabited. The primary sources are Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, Gylfaginning chapters 49 and 50, composed around 1220 CE, and the older poem Baldur's Draumr from the Poetic Edda, which preserves Odin's own desperate journey to the underworld to learn his son's fate before it happened. What scholars have never fully resolved is the mistletoe itself, a plant with almost no independent ritual significance anywhere else in the entire Norse textual record, appearing in this single myth as the one fatal exception to an otherwise total oath, in stark contrast to the plant's heavily documented sacred status in Celtic Druidic practice among Norse Scandinavia's nearest neighbors, where mistletoe was cut with golden sickles in rituals so significant that Roman writers recorded them centuries before this Norse account was ever written down, raising the real possibility that the story preserves a fragment of an older, imported ritual killing whose original meaning had already been lost by the time Snorri set it down on parchment. Frigg's oath covered every object with weight, edge, or venom, and still missed the one thing too young and too small to seem worth asking. If the only gap in a universal promise is the single detail everyone agreed was too insignificant to matter, the real question is not what killed Balder. It is why the being who loved him enough to ask the entire universe for a favor still could not imagine the one-shaped death was actually going to take. Number 2. Kingu. Before a tribunal of gods who had already decided the verdict before the trial began, a prisoner stood bound with the tablets of destiny still fastened to his chest, an object of such absolute cosmic authority that whoever legitimately held it could issue commands that reality itself was compelled to obey. The prisoner was Kingu, and until recently he had been the second husband of Tiamat, the primordial sea, elevated to command her monstrous army after her first consort Apsu was killed by his own divine children. Tiamat had placed the tablets on Kingu specifically to make his authority over the gathered forces of chaos absolute and unquestionable, fastening them to his chest herself in front of the assembled army, a promotion that made him, for a brief and unrepeatable period, the most powerful individual being in the Mesopotamian cosmos. That authority ended the moment Tiamat did, when Marduk defeated her in single combat, splitting her body to build the sky and the earth. Kingu's army scattered and his protection dissolved with it, the monsters she had birthed fleeing in every direction with no one left to command them. He was captured, stripped of the tablets on the spot, and brought before the assembled gods to be formally charged as the instigator of the entire rebellion, the one whose hand had literally held the instrument of command while Tiamat's forces moved against the younger gods. The trial itself is described with a coldness that has no real parallel elsewhere in Mesopotamian myth. There is no torture, no drawn-out punishment, no elaborate execution scene lingered over for its own sake. Kingu is named, judged, and killed, efficiently, as a matter of procedure rather than vengeance. His blood collected immediately afterward for a purpose the gods had apparently already settled on before the verdict was even formally read aloud. Marduk mixed Kingu's blood with clay and shaped from it the first human beings, created for one explicit, stated purpose. To perform the labor, the lesser gods had grown tired of doing themselves, the digging of canals, the maintenance of temples, freeing the divine assembly permanently from the physical toil of maintaining the world with their own hands. Humanity, in this account, does not begin as an act of love, breath, or curiosity. It begins as a labor solution, engineered from the executed remains of a defeated enemy combatant, built specifically, deliberately, and without ceremony to work. The primary source is the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic recovered from cuneiform tablets in the library of Ashurbanipal, with tablet 6 containing both Kingu's execution and the deliberate, purposeful creation of mankind from his blood, described in language closer to a manufacturing instruction than a birth. What makes this account remarkable is not that it stands alone. A closely parallel Mesopotamian text, the Atrahasis epic, dating to the Old Babylonian period around the 18th century BCE, and therefore older than the Enuma Elish itself, describes an almost identical event, humans formed from clay mixed with the blood and flesh of a slain god named Willa. Specifically so, the lesser gods could stop performing agricultural and irrigation labor themselves. Two separate Mesopotamian textual traditions, composed centuries apart in different cities under different dynasties, converge independently on the same specific claim that the human species originates in a deliberate act of bioengineering performed on the remains of an executed divine prisoner. This is the detail that modern ancient astronaut researchers return to more than any other single passage in the ancient Near Eastern record, because the language used is not the language of miracle or breath, as in later traditions, but the language of construction, mixing ratios, and functional purpose. The oldest civilization to leave behind a written account of its own creation did not describe itself as chosen, blessed, or born. It described itself as manufactured from specific raw materials by a designer with a labor shortage to solve, using the blood of a defeated enemy as the one ingredient that could make inert clay capable of independent thought, motion, and obedience. Kingu himself disappears from the narrative entirely the moment his blood is extracted. No burial, no memorial, no further mention anywhere in the text, his sole surviving legacy being every single human being who has ever lived afterward, walking around in bodies built, according to the oldest creation account, Mesopotamia left behind. From clay and the blood of a god, the other gods had already decided to kill before they gave him the trial that made it official. If that account was even partially remembering something real, the blood the story insists made you capable of thought is not somewhere distant or symbolic. According to the poem itself, it is in the room with you right now. Number 3. Osiris. In the marshlands of the Nile Delta, in a season the Egyptians never dated because the event stood outside ordinary time, a chest built to the precise measurements of a sleeping man was sealed shut and thrown into the river. The chest had been commissioned in secret, built by carpenters who did not know why the dimensions mattered, and presented as a gift at a banquet where 72 conspirators waited for one Maniash to lie down inside it so they could nail the lid closed and hurl it into the current. The god inside the chest was Osiris, king of Egypt, lord of grain, and firstborn son of the sky goddess Nut. He did not resist. By the time he understood what the chest actually was, the lid was already sealed, and the river was already carrying him toward the sea. The conspiracy belonged to his brother Set, god of storms and the red desert beyond the fertile black land, a being the Egyptians understood as necessary and dangerous in equal measure. Set had watched Osiris civilize Egypt, teach agriculture, and establish law, and had decided that a kingdom built on order had no room for two brothers. The chest drifted out of Egypt entirely, crossing open water to the coast of Byblos in modern Lebanon, where it lodged in the roots of a tamarisk tree that grew around it so completely the chest itself became invisible, sealed inside a rising trunk that local builders eventually cut down and installed as a palace pillar, a god sleeping inside timber holding up a foreign king's roof for years while Egypt searched for him in vain. Osiris's wife and sister, Isis, found him there, disguised as a servant in the foreign court until she could recover the pillar and free the chest inside it. She brought his body back to Egypt and briefly revived him long enough to conceive their son Horus before concealing the body in the marshes of the delta, believing at last that he was safe. It was not enough. Set found the chest a second time while hunting at night, and this time he did not seal it. He tore Osiris into pieces, by most accounts 14, and scattered them the length of Egypt, from the delta to Aswan, each fragment left in the nome, the province, where it happened to fall. This is the detail the Egyptians never treated as decoration. Egypt's religious geography was organized for centuries around the specific belief that a piece of a god's body was buried in each region, a distributed relic system spanning the length of the kingdom, with the head, by the dominant tradition, resting at Abydos, a site that remained an active pilgrimage destination into the Roman period, nearly 3,000 years after the events it commemorated. Isis searched the entire length of the river for the scattered pieces, aided by her sister Nephthys and the jackal-headed Anubis, reassembling her husband's body with such care that classical writers described her as inventing the practice of embalming in the process. She recovered every piece except one, the phallus, which had been eaten by a Nile fish and could not be restored, so she fashioned a golden replacement and used it to conceive the child already growing inside her. What Isis brought back to life was not the living king who had once ruled Egypt. Osiris rose again as ruler of the Juat, lord of the dead, judge of every soul that entered the underworld afterward, permanently relocated from the world of the living to the world beneath it, present at every burial forever, but never again on his own throne above ground. The primary literary source for the full sequence is Plutarch's essay on Isis and Osiris, written in Greek around 100 CE, drawing on Egyptian tradition already thousands of years old by the time he recorded it. The earliest surviving fragments are far older, embedded in the pyramid texts carved into the burial chambers of 5th and 6th dynasty pharaohs, beginning around 2400 BCE, spells that identify the dead king directly with Osiris, urging his body to reassemble exactly as the gods once did, joint returning to joint, organ returning to its place. What those texts describe is not remembrance. It is a working ritual formula, repeated across 2,500 years of Egyptian civilization, for reversing dismemberment through precise, ordered reconstruction, applied to every mummified body prepared according to Osirian rite, the internal organs separated, preserved in canopic jars under the protection of 4 named guardian spirits, and eventually restored to the body in the correct sequence, as though the entire apparatus of Egyptian mummification was reverse-engineered from watching how Isis put her husband back together, piece by numbered piece. Egypt did not treat the death of Osiris as a story about grief. It treated it as documentation of a procedure, and it built its entire relationship with death around replicating that procedure, generation after generation, for as long as the civilization survived. If an empire spent 3,000 years perfecting the exact physical steps required to reassemble a body that had already, according to its own religion, been successfully reassembled once before, what was it actually trying to remember, and what was it trying to be ready to do again? Number 4. Baal. On the slopes of Mount Zaphon, the mountain the Canaanites believed sat at the literal center of the world, a messenger arrived at the storm god's palace with an invitation phrased as a threat. The messenger came from Mot, god of death, and the parched underworld, and his message was simple. Baal was to descend into Mot's own throat, to walk willingly into the god of death's open mouth, and be swallowed. Because Mot's hunger for the storm god's flesh could no longer be satisfied any other way. Baal, storm god and king of the Canaanite pantheon, the being responsible for rain, fertility, and the harvest that kept every city on the Levantine coast alive, understood the invitation for what it was. He could refuse and be branded a coward before the entire divine assembly, or he could go down into Mot's gullet and see what happened. He went down. Baal did not return. Word reached the high god El that his storm god had been swallowed whole, and El's mourning was not symbolic. He came down from his throne, cut his own skin with a blade, poured ash over his head, and gashed his cheeks and chest in a grief so total that the text itself pauses to describe the wounds in physical detail. Above ground, the consequence was immediate and agricultural. Without Baal, the rains stopped. The fields cracked. The Canaanite world, entirely dependent on the storm god's seasonal rains for its harvest, began to starve in real time, a famine written directly into the mythology as the literal, physical result of a god's death. It was Anat, Baal's sister and consort, fierce goddess of war and hunting, who went looking for the body. She found it, recovered it from the land of the dead, and buried him on Mount Zaphon itself with funerary rites so lavish that 70 wild oxen and 70 sheep were sacrificed at the tomb. That alone would have been enough to end most myths of this kind. Anat was not finished. She hunted down Mot, seized him, and did to the god of death exactly what he had done to her brother, and worse. She split him open with a blade, winnowed him in a sieve, the way grain is separated from chaff, burned him with fire, ground his remains between millstones, and scattered what was left of him across a field for the birds to eat, an act of destruction so complete that ancient audiences would have recognized it immediately as the imagery of a harvest, a god of death processed like wheat. Baal returned to life shortly afterward, restored to his throne on Zaphon, and the rains returned with him. The primary source is the Baal cycle, a sequence of Ugaritic tablets catalogued as KTU tablets 1 through 6, composed in the Late Bronze Age, roughly 1400 to 1200 BCE, and recovered from the ruins of the ancient city of Ugarit at the site now called Ras Shamra on the Syrian coast. For close to 3,000 years, nothing of this text existed anywhere in the accessible historical record. The only account of Baal available to the world was hostile, preserved entirely in the Hebrew Bible, where the books of Kings describe Elijah's confrontation with Baal's prophets on Mount Carmel and treat his worship as the central religious threat to ancient Israel. That changed in 1929, when the French archaeologist Claude Schaeffer began excavating Ras Shamra and uncovered a royal library of clay tablets that had been buried, untouched, since the city's destruction around 1185 BCE, preserving Baal's own religion, in his own worshippers' words, for the first time since the Bronze Age collapse silenced it. What modern researchers have not stopped puzzling over is the sheer completeness of that silence. An entire coastal civilization, its chief god, and its most detailed surviving myth of death and resurrection sat buried and unread for nearly 3 millennia, known to the outside world only through the accounts of the people actively trying to erase it. The Assyriologist Mark Smith, whose multi-volume study of the Baal cycle remains the standard modern reference, has argued that the tablets preserve not folklore but a functioning liturgy, recited text meant to be performed, rather than simply read, which makes the silence that followed its burial even harder to explain as accident alone. The human echo of that silence did not stop at Ugarit. Centuries after the Baal cycle was composed, the Hebrew Bible's first book of Kings describes the prophet Elijah confronting 450 of Baal's own prophets on Mount Carmel. And after Baal's fire fails to descend, and Elijah's does, the text records the prophet seized and slaughtered at the Kishon River below the mountain, a real, textually explicit human execution of the god's living priesthood, carried out in his own storm god's name by worshippers of a rival deity who considered the killing not a crime but a mercy owed to the land. If a god can be swallowed once by death and still return, and have his prophets cut down by human hands centuries later, and still be worshipped in secret for generations afterward, the line between killing a god and simply killing the last people willing to speak for him stops being obvious at all. Number 5. Tiamat. In the churning saltwater that existed before the gods had cities or names for themselves, a young storm god rode out alone against an ocean that was, itself, alive and furious and old enough to have given birth to every god preparing to fight her. The storm god was Marduk, and the ocean was Tiamat, primordial goddess of the sea and mother of the first generation of gods, a being so ancient that the very concept of divine genealogy in Mesopotamian religion begins with her. For most of the story that precedes this battle, Tiamat is not a villain. She is origin itself, the salt water that mixed with the sweet water of her consort Apsu to produce the first gods, patient with her noisy, restless children, even as their activity disturbed Apsu's rest so badly that he resolved to destroy them. The younger gods killed Apsu first, preemptively, while he slept, and it was only after losing her husband to her own children that Tiamat transformed from patient mother into something else entirely, something the poem itself struggles to describe without resorting to the language of monstrosity. She built an army from the substance of chaos itself, giving birth to 11 classes of monsters, serpents with venom instead of blood, scorpion men, lion demons, and raising her new consort Kingu to lead them, placing the tablets of destiny on his chest to grant him command over fate. The younger gods, terrified, searched for a champion willing to face her and found none until Marduk offered himself, on one condition. If he won, he would be granted supremacy over the entire pantheon, a rank higher than his own father held, an ascension no god had ever demanded as a precondition for combat before him. The gods agreed, because they had no other option, and Marduk rode out to meet the being that had made the universe possible in the first place. The battle, as recorded, was not a contest of equal strength. Marduk cast a net around Tiamat to trap her, raised the 4 winds to pin her in place, and when she opened her mouth to devour him, drove the wind directly into her body, distending her until an arrow could be fired straight through her open jaws into her belly, killing her instantly. What Marduk did next is the detail that separates this myth from almost every other killing of a god in the ancient world. He did not bury her, mourn her, or leave her body where it fell. He split her corpse in half like a shellfish being cracked open, and from the 2 halves built the physical architecture of the world. One half became the vault of the sky, fixed in place with bolts and guards to hold back the waters above it forever. The other half became the earth beneath, with her eyes becoming the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and her tail becoming the Milky Way stretched across the heavens, and her spit, by some readings of the text, seeding the clouds that still cross the sky she was turned into. The primary source is the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, surviving in copies recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE, but describing events the Babylonians themselves regarded as belonging to a much older oral tradition, recited annually during the Akitu New Year festival as a literal account of how the ordered world came into being. Tablets 4 and 5 contain the battle and the dismemberment in specific, deliberate detail, describing the construction of sky and earth from Tiamat's body with the same procedural precision used elsewhere in the poem to describe the construction of temples, brick by brick, span by span. It is this insistence on cosmological literalism, a body split to form the sky and a separate body of water beneath it, that drew the attention of the controversial 20th century writer Zecharia Sitchin, who argued the Enuma Elish preserved a garbled memory of an actual astronomical collision. A rogue planetary body he called Nibru striking a primordial world he identified with Tiamat and splitting it into the asteroid belt and modern Earth. Mainstream Assyriologists reject this reading entirely, and it remains one of the most disputed interpretations in the history of ancient astronaut theory. What is not disputed is that the Babylonians who wrote this poem down and recited it every single year were not telling a metaphor about seasonal change. They were describing, with the specificity of an engineering report, exactly how the visible sky above their heads and the ground beneath their feet had been built from the body of something they killed. The New Year festival that reenacted this battle continued in Babylon for well over 1,000 years, priests reciting the poem from beginning to end as the literal charter of the world's continued existence, as though the order holding sky above earth required annual, ritual confirmation that the killing had actually happened, and the body was still, structurally, doing its job. Number 6. Coyolxauhqui. On the summit of Kodipek, Serpent Mountain, a woman swept the temple grounds at dawn when a ball of feathers drifted down from the sky and settled against her body. The woman was Coyolxauhqui, mother of the 400 stars, and their sister, and she tucked the feathers into her waistband without much thought, only to discover afterward that she was pregnant, with no husband and no explanation her existing children found remotely acceptable. Her daughter, Coyolxauhqui, goddess of the moon, decided her mother's pregnancy was an unforgivable disgrace to the family and convinced her 400 brothers, the Sensan Huitznahua, stars of the southern sky, to march on their own mother and kill her before the shame could be born into the world. Coyolxauhqui's unborn son heard the plan from inside the womb and did not wait to be born in any ordinary sense. As the army of siblings reached the summit of Coyolxauhqui, weapons raised and already climbing the final steps toward their mother, Huitzilopochtli was born instantly and fully grown, already armed with the fire serpent Xucotel, a war god arriving into the world for the sole purpose of defending his mother from an execution already underway. He struck first, and struck at the source. Coyolxauhqui, the sister who had organized the attack, was decapitated on the mountaintop, her head severed and thrown down the slope, her body dismembered joint by joint and hurled after it, breaking apart against the rocks as it tumbled, piece by piece. Down the side of the very mountain her army had just climbed to commit matricide. Huitzilopochtli did not stop there. He turned on the 400 brothers who had followed her and killed most of them as well, scattering the handful of survivors to the edges of the sky, where Aztec cosmology places them still, as the stars that flee before dawn when the sun, understood as Huitzilopochtli reborn each morning, rises over the horizon to hunt them across the sky again. The primary narrative source is the Florentine Codex, compiled under the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún between 1545 and 1590 CE. Drawing on Nahua informants who preserved the mythology of a civilization already under active destruction at the time of recording. Book 3, containing the fullest surviving account of the birth and the killing on Coyolxauhqui. For centuries, this myth existed only as text, a violent origin story for the Aztecs' patron war god, dismissible as symbolic explanation for the sun's daily victory over night, one myth among hundreds. That changed in February of 1978, when electrical utility workers digging in downtown Mexico City struck stone roughly 8 feet below street level and uncovered a carved monolith just over 10 feet across, weighing an estimated 8 tons, depicting a decapitated, dismembered female figure, head separated cleanly from the torso, limbs disjointed and arranged around a central knot at the waist, a serpent belt marking her divinity beyond any doubt about who she was. The stone was Coyolxauhqui, and it had been buried directly at the base of the Templo Mayor, the holiest temple in the entire Aztec Empire, positioned deliberately at the foot of the staircase leading up to Huitzilopochtli's shrine, so that any sacrificial victim thrown down those steps after having their heart removed would land directly on top of the carved image of the sister he had already dismembered once. The ritual reenacting the myth with real human bodies on a repeating, permanent stage the Aztecs had built and maintained at the exact geographic center of their capital for as long as the empire stood, generation after generation of priests climbing over her broken stone image without ever removing it. The excavation that followed the discovery, conducted by archaeologist Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, ultimately uncovered the full footprint of the Templo Mayor beneath modern Mexico City, confirming that the Aztecs had built their empire's single most sacred structure directly atop a permanent stone monument to a sibling's execution, a myth the empire's own war. God both committed and, through centuries of continued ritual sacrifice on that exact spot, apparently never stopped needing to repeat. Coyolxauhqui was not condemned by the civilization that worshipped her killer. She was carved in stone, buried at his feet, and stepped over by every priest who climbed those stairs, an eternal loser in a war her own myth. Admits she started to protect her mother's honor, broken apart on a mountainside that the Aztecs decided, deliberately and permanently, to build their entire capital on top of. Number 7. Attis. Beneath a pine tree on a Phrygian hillside, a young man knelt in a state that witnesses across centuries of retelling could never fully agree was madness, ecstasy, or both at once, and picked up a sharpened stone. He was already bleeding from self-inflicted wounds across his chest by the time he castrated himself, and he did not stop until he had done it completely, dying beneath the tree from the blood loss that followed. His name was Attis, consort of Cybele, the Great Mother, and the goddess who drove him to that hillside had loved him first. The myth's darkest version, preserved by the Christian writer Arnobius around 300 CE from far older Phrygian tradition, begins even before Attis was born, with a being named Agdistes, born both male and female and so wild and powerful that the gods themselves castrated the deity out of fear, the severed organs falling to earth and growing into an almond tree. A river nymph named Nana placed one of the almonds against her body and conceived Attis without any father at all. Attis grew into a beauty that drew Cybele, herself descended from the same castration, into obsessive love. When Attis prepared to marry a mortal princess instead, Cybele, or Agdistes in the myth's oldest layer, appeared at the wedding feast and drove him into a frenzy that ended with him mutilating himself under the pine tree in front of the wedding guests, bleeding out at the base of the very tree that would become sacred to his cult. Cybele's grief, once it broke through her fury, was absolute. She begged the sky god for one concession, and the myth insists she received it. Attis's body, Ovid records in the Fasti around 8 CE, would never decay. His hair would keep growing. His smallest finger would keep moving, permanently, for as long as the world lasted, a body dead by every measure except the 2 or 3 signs of life the gods allowed it to keep. What makes Attis unlike every other entry on this list is that his death did not stay contained in myth. Rome imported the cult of Cybele officially in 204 BCE, during the darkest years of the war against Hannibal, on the direct instruction of the Sibylline books, which claimed Rome could not survive the war without the Great Mother's protection. A black meteoric stone believed to be Cybele herself was carried from Pessinus in Phrygia to Rome and installed on the Palatine Hill. With her came Attis, and with Attis came the Galli, priests who castrated themselves in direct imitation of the god they served, wore women's clothing, and every year on the 24th of March, a day the Romans called the Day of Blood, whipped themselves and reenacted the self-mutilation under a sacred pine carried into the temple, followed the next day by a festival of wild public joy, celebrating a resurrection that the priests' own bodies had just finished paying for. The primary sources include Catulus's poem 63, composed in the 1st century BCE, with a physical, almost hallucinatory intensity that makes clear the poet had witnessed the Galli firsthand, Ovid's Fasti Book 4, and Arnobius's Adversus Nations for the Agdistes origin. The historian of religion Martin Vermazerin, whose 1977 study of the cult remains the standard modern reference, documented the full 9-day festival calendar built around Attis's death, culminating each year in a rite called the Arbor Intrit, in which a pine tree wrapped like a corpse and bound with wool was carried into the temple as a physical stand-in for the god's own body, mourned by the priesthood as though the death were happening again for the first time. What archaeology adds is harder to dismiss than any single text. Excavations on Vatican Hill, beneath and around the site where the center of the Roman Catholic Church now stands, uncovered a Phrygianum, an active sanctuary to Cybele and Attis where priests performed Taurobolium rituals, ritually slaughtering bulls over a pit and bathing in the blood as a rite of purification and rebirth. Inscribed altars from that same hillside are dated as late as 390 CE, meaning a working cult center for a self-castrated, resurrected dying god was still operating on that exact hill within living memory of Christianity's own final triumph in Rome. Cybele asked for her lover's body to be preserved rather than restored, kept dead but twitching rather than alive, a compromise that gave her almost everything except the one thing she actually wanted. If the ground beneath one of the holiest sites in the modern world once belonged to a god who bled to death under a tree and was never quite permitted to either live again or fully die, what exactly did the hill decide to remember, and what did it choose to build over instead? Number 8. Dumuzi. In a shepherd's camp at dusk, a young king sat among cushions and music, dressed in his finest robes, entirely unaware that demons had already crossed the threshold between the underworld and the living world, and were walking toward him with explicit orders to take him back with them. His name was Dumuzi, also known by the later name Tammuz, husband of Inanna, goddess of love and war, and the reason the demons were coming for him had nothing to do with any crime he had personally committed. It was the result of a bargain his own wife had made to save herself. Inanna had descended into the underworld to challenge her older sister Ereshkigal, queen of the dead, on Ereshkigal's own territory, stripped of her royal garments and ornaments, at each of the 7 gates along the way, as the law of the underworld required, until she arrived naked and powerless before her sister's throne and was struck dead on the spot, her body hung on a hook like meat left to rot in the dark. She was eventually revived through the intervention of the god Enki, who fashioned two sexless creatures capable of slipping past the underworld's defenses to revive her with the food and water of life. But the law of the dead was absolute. No one leaves the underworld without providing a substitute to take their place, and Inanna was escorted back to the surface by a retinue of demons with explicit instructions to seize whoever she chose to send down in her stead. She found her husband not mourning her disappearance, not wearing sackcloth, not performing any of the grief the underworld's law seemed to expect of the living left behind. Dumuzi was seated on her own throne in fine clothing, apparently untroubled by his wife's death, and Inanna's response was immediate and without mercy. She looked at him, and by her own word, condemned him, handing her own husband over to the very demons who had escorted her home, sentencing him to take the place in the underworld that she herself had just escaped. Dumuzi fled, hiding first in the grass, then transforming through the aid of the sun god Utu into a gazelle to escape the demons pursuing him across the countryside, but the underworld's law did not bend for effort or terror. He was eventually caught. His sister, Jeshtanana, refused every opportunity to reveal his hiding place even under direct questioning by the demons, an act of loyalty that ultimately reshaped the sentence rather than reversing it. The final arrangement, negotiated after Dumuzi's capture, split the year in two. Dumuzi would spend half of it in the underworld, while Jeshtanana took his place for the other half, an alternating sentence that Mesopotamian religion mapped directly onto the agricultural cycle, the shepherd god's presence and absence, explaining why the land produced and then failed to produce, season after season, without end. The primary source is the descent of Inanna to the underworld, preserved on Sumerian cuneiform tablets, dating from roughly 1900 to 1600 BCE. Though the oral tradition behind them is almost certainly far older, making this one of the oldest extended narratives ever committed to writing by any civilization on Earth. Fragments and parallel versions survive across multiple tablet collections, including holdings now split between institutions, such as the Penn Museum and the British Museum. Reconstructed over more than a century of careful philological work piecing together a single coherent narrative from broken clay recovered a continent apart. What is unsettling about the account is not cruelty in the usual sense. There is no monster, no battle, no visible violence in the moment of Dumuzi's sentencing. There is only a legal mechanism, a substitution clause in the underworld's law, applied without exception even to a goddess's own husband, and a wife who chooses to enforce it rather than absorb the cost herself. Some Sitchin-adjacent researchers have pointed to the sheer procedural coldness of the account. Gates, garments removed one by one, a fixed legal requirement for substitution, as reading less like devotional religion and more like a formal administrative record of an actual transaction between two governing powers, translated imperfectly across thousands of years into myth. Was Inanna a grieving wife protecting herself with the only tool the law gave her? Or was she the actual executioner, choosing her own husband's death over her own? The moment she found him too comfortable on a throne she had nearly died to keep. Number 9. Zalmoxis. At a banquet north of the Danube, in a hall built for a people the Greek historian Herodotus called the noblest and most just of all the Thracian tribes, the host welcomed his most powerful and trusted guests, fed them, and then, without explanation or warning, disappeared into an underground chamber built beneath his own home and did not come back out. His name was Zalmoxis, worshipped as a god by the Geti, a Thracian people who held a belief unlike almost anything else in the ancient world. They did not think death ended a person. They believed that dying simply meant going to live with Zalmoxis, permanently, in whatever place he had gone to first, and they mourned accordingly, or rather, by Herodotus's account, they often did not mourn at all, treating funerals among their own people as celebrations, because the dead had only gone home. The disappearance at the banquet, according to the version of the story Herodotus collected from Greeks living near the Hellespont and the Black Sea, was staged. Zalmoxis, in this telling, was not born a god, but had once been an enslaved man on the island of Samos, owned for a time by the philosopher Pythagoras himself, absorbing Ionian teachings on the soul's immortality before earning his freedom, growing wealthy, and returning home to Thrace. To convince the Getae that the soul survived the body, he built the underground chamber in secret, told his most important followers he was leaving them, and then vanished into it. For 3 full years, the Getae grieved him as dead. In the 4th year, Zalmoxis walked back out of the chamber into daylight, alive, unmarked, exactly as he had been before, and the Gede, having already mourned a genuine death and witnessed what looked unmistakably like a genuine resurrection, accepted his teaching on the soul's immortality as settled fact from that day forward. Herodotus, writing this down around 440 BCE in Book 4 of his Histories, does something he rarely bothers to do anywhere else in the text. He tells the reader directly that he does not know whether to believe it, that the underground chamber story sounds to him like a trick, but that he personally suspects Zalmoxis lived many generations before Pythagoras ever existed, which would make the entire slave of Pythagoras version chronologically impossible, and, in Herodotus's own careful phrasing, probably invented by Greeks trying to explain a foreign god they didn't understand by attaching him to a Greek philosopher they did. The doubt is not incidental. It is the earliest surviving instance of an ancient historian directly interrogating whether a god's death and resurrection was a real event or an engineered performance, written by a man who had personally traveled the region and spoken to the people who still practiced the religion. What Herodotus reports, without any doubt at all, is stranger than the disappearance itself. Every 4 years, the Gede selected a messenger by lottery and threw him bodily into the air onto the points of raised spears, sending him, by their own explicit belief, to deliver requests directly to Zalmoxis in the place beyond death. If the man died on the spears, the message was considered received and the omens good. If he survived the fall, they blamed him personally for being unworthy and selected another messenger to try again. This was not folklore recorded secondhand. Herodotus describes it as an ongoing practice, still being performed among the Gede in his own lifetime, a real recurring ritual execution built entirely around the logistics of communicating with a god whose own death had never been fully confirmed. The later geographer Strabo, writing around 20 CE, adds that Zalmoxis retreated to a sacred cave on a mountain called Koganon, and that a line of priest kings after him continued living in that same cave for generations, appearing rarely, treated as living oracles and advisors to the Gedic kings, maintaining the god's authority long after any possibility that the original man was still alive. The Romanian historian of religion Mircea Eliade devoted an entire study to the figure in 1972, arguing that Zalmoxis represented a distinct and unusually literal current in ancient religious thought, a god whose entire authority rested on having demonstrably, physically returned from a death his own people had genuinely and completely believed in. Whether Zalmoxis died once in a staged disappearance and lived out the rest of his life in hiding, or never existed as anything but a title passed between cave-dwelling priests generation after generation, the Gede kept sending men onto spear points to reach him for as long as anyone was still counting. If an entire people can build a permanent, functioning religion around a death that its own historian suspected was a trick, what does it actually take to kill a god, and is a staged death, believed completely by everyone who witnesses it, any different from a real one? Number 10. Pan. On a becalmed sea near the Echinades Islands, off the western coast of Greece, sometime during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius, an Egyptian ship's pilot named Thamus sat awake at the helm while most of the passengers slept, the vessel drifting without wind near a small island called Paxi. A voice called his name across the water, loudly enough to wake him fully, and he did not answer at first, assuming he had imagined it. It called again. On the third call, Thamus answered, and the voice gave him an instruction that made no sense to a man with no religious authority and no reason to be trusted with a message of any importance. When his ship reached a place called Palodes, the voice told him he was to announce to the shore that the great god Pan was dead. Thamus considered ignoring it entirely, and by most tellings very nearly did. But when the ship reached Palodes and the wind dropped to nothing, he stood at the rail facing the empty coastline and shouted the words anyway, into what appeared to be uninhabited land. What answered him was not silence. According to the account, a chorus of groaning, mourning, and lamentation rose from the shore itself, many voices at once, as though an entire unseen population had been waiting specifically to hear that announcement and had been listening the whole time. The primary source for the entire episode is Plutarch, writing in his essay on the obsolescence of oracles around 100 CE, attributing the story to his own teacher, who claimed to have heard it directly from Thamus's own testimony as it circulated afterward. The story reportedly reached Tiberius himself, who summoned scholars to his court specifically to determine who or what Pan actually was and whether a god, of all beings, could die the way a mortal does. No answer Plutarch records ever settled the question. What makes Pan's death unlike every other entry on this list is that nothing was ever recovered. No body was found on any shore. No weapon, no tomb, no relic, no scattered remains, no object taken and kept by anyone. There is only a report, second-hand even in its oldest surviving version, of a voice heard once, over water, by a single named man who had no reason to lie and no way to prove he hadn't. Centuries later, the Christian historian Eusebius of Caesarea, writing his Preparatio Evangelica in the early 4th century CE, seized on the story's rough timing, a reported death during Tiberius's reign, as evidence that the pagan gods themselves had been struck silent by the arrival of Christianity, an interpretation that turned a strange maritime anecdote into a piece of religious propaganda for centuries afterward, repeated by Christian writers for well over 1,000 years as proof that their god had personally silenced every rival on the same afternoon. Modern classicists have proposed something stranger still. Several scholars, working from the phonetics of the ancient Greek, have argued that Thamus never heard the words Pan ho megas tethnek, the great Pan is dead, at all, but rather a ritual lament for Thamus himself to carry, Thamus Pantheus Tethnek, or possibly a mangled Greek rendering of an older Near Eastern mourning cry for a dying god already familiar across that same sea for thousands of years, Thomas, the very shepherd god whose death by another name already sits earlier on this list, mourned by his own worshippers with an identical seasonal wail carried from harbor to harbor, long after anyone remembered where the custom began. No source ever resolves it. Nobody proves the voice belonged to Pan, or to Tammuz, or to nothing at all beyond one tired sailor's imagination on a windless night. And that may be the most honest ending this list can offer. 9 other gods on this countdown left something behind when they died, a body reassembled piece by piece, a corpse turned into the sky itself, blood mixed into human clay, a stone monument buried at a temple's foot, tablets recovered and shelved to wait. Pan left nothing. No relic, no grave, no confession. Only a rumor that traveled from one frightened man's mouth into the historical record and never once slowed down long enough to be checked. 10 gods, 10 civilizations that never spoke to one another, and in every single case, something was killed, something was taken, and something was kept, remembered, or buried in its place, except once, at the very end, when all that survived was the sound of an empty coastline answering a stranger who was only passing through. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.